Hello everyone, and welcome back, or welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be responding to Contrapoints' most recent video, The Witch Trials of JK Rowling, as well as some bits of her last video on JK Rowling. And if you're watching this video because you're a subscriber and you happen not to know who Contrapoints is, basically, she's kind of the most influential YouTuber in terms of left-wing politics on YouTube. And Contrapoints, also known as Natalie Wynn, has been on YouTube for a very long time. I started watching her like 6 or 7 years ago, so post-atheism skeptic days, but pre-gender transition days. That's when I started watching her, and I find her thoroughly entertaining and intelligent, even when I disagree with her, which of course I'm my own thinking person, so even though I consume content all across the political spectrum, I always agree and disagree with different things people are saying, as I expect is the case with my own audience. And if you're new to my channel and you don't know who I am, I'm essentially exactly what Natalie Wynn describes in her video when she describes toxic centrism. I'm someone who advocates strongly for free speech on my channel. I discuss political polarization and the like. And then of course I also talk about art and media and internet culture and all of that good stuff in case you're interested. I also tend to upset people from many different political persuasions. That's always sort of my goal, and I feel like this video is going to do a lot of that. It's honestly, there's nothing more controversial right now in American culture than transgender issues, including a lot of the other countries in the first world as well. And before I get into my critiques of Natalie Wynn's videos, I will say up front, this is not going to be me defending JK Rowling in any way. I honestly don't care about her, and I don't care about Harry Potter, so sorry if you're a Harry Potter fan, you could go ahead and dislike now. I guess up front, I'll also say a bit about my views on transgender issues, what I agree with Natalie and what I disagree with, especially since that might be a deal breaker for some people on whether or not they want to continue on with this video. Personally, as I've stated before on my channel, I think everyone should have equality regardless of race, gender, or sex. And obviously that includes transgender people. I also happen to be someone who thinks that gender and sex aren't always the same. Like, I do think there's a biological basis for the expression of gender, like your gender expression. But I personally have no qualms with a biological male or female identifying as the opposite sex. That's just me. I also don't think that that's a prerequisite for supporting equality for transgender people. The majority of people in America believe that sex and gender are the same and are immutable, but most Americans also support broad equality for transgender people. There are just a few sort of hot button issues that people have disagreements on, myself included. I do think biological distinctions are necessary when talking about things like trans women in sports or where to put people in prison, like trans criminals. There are obviously some issues in which your biological sex does matter, and it matters much more than your gender identity. But what I do agree with Natalie in her video is the idea that policing bathrooms is like fucking stupid. I've always thought bathroom bills were stupid long before JK Rowling said anything about them. I know it's always been a hot button issue in like American politics for a while now, but I think it would be impossible and impractical to police because you would literally have to prove your legal gender anytime you enter the bathroom, and that's just not happening. It really is based on what you look like in terms of what gender you present as and what people think you are, more so than your biological sex as to whether or not someone may confront you in a bathroom. But where I strongly disagree with Natalie in terms of transgender issues is the medicalization of children. I'm totally against this. I think if you're not old enough to consent to a vasectomy or getting your tubes tied or even getting a tattoo, I don't think you're capable of consenting to taking cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers that make it so you're sterile. I also don't think you can consent to surgeries that are irreversible. I mean, I don't even think you could get a nose job as a teenager. And if you can, you shouldn't. Like most people in America, I'm totally fine with trans issues. It's just the medicalization of children and trans women in sports that I am against. And so in this video, I'll be criticizing Natalie's attempts to smear the topic of medicalization of children as inherently transphobic or bigoted. And more importantly than that, probably, her open contempt and hostility towards free speech. This is extremely alarming. The flags for me were first raised in her JK Rowling video. I mean, she's never exactly been a free speech advocate, all right? If you've been watching for a long time, you know that. But lately, I feel like she's been cranking it up like 10 notches, even on the verge of advocating for violence, which is what I'm going to be talking about in this video. And before I get into the real meat of the arguments, I have to be nitpicky for a second because there's something Contra said in her JK Rowling video that I felt totally gaslighted by, and because everyone, you know, parrots and echoes everything Contrapoint says without thinking critically for themselves first, that's like essentially all of left-wing YouTube. I've been seeing other people say this and it's just blatantly false, and that's where she says no trans person thinks that you can change your chromosomal sex, and to believe that is to argue in bad faith.
No trans person thinks it's possible to change chromosomal sex, and to pretend otherwise is to argue in bad faith. When we say that someone is a trans man or a trans woman, we're talking about psychological and social identity.
So I've argued with people in real life before who assert and believe that biological sex isn't real, But Contrapoints herself has insinuated or explicitly said that she believes you can change your sex before.
You know, in what sense are you fully biological male if you've undergone hormone replacement therapy? In some senses, you have sexual characteristics of a woman. So why insist on like this born male at birth and like that can never be changed thing, when in fact you can and do change your biology?
You can alter certain aspects of your biology, but you can't alter the fact that you were born male and will die male. That's just is what it is. Again, we're talking technically. So you're saying, why do you insist on this? Well, it's because there's a lot of people that I encounter online when I have these debates and these conversations that would never concede that trans women are biologically male. And so it's worth stating. Ultimately, and that's why
what does it mean to be biologically male? I mean, again, I suspect that the direction this is going is going to be back to just like, oh, that's what the doctor assigned you at birth, or oh, you have XY chromosomes. But as I discussed in my most recent video about gender, this biological binary is actually not all that straightforward of a distinction. Especially when you get to, you know, someone who, if you have XY chromosomes, but you're taking estrogen, you're taking hormones, and you develop female secondary sex characteristics.
Yes, I mean you can, like I said.
Why say that you're biologically male?
Because I am. You're born with male chromosomes. You're born with a penis. You're born with a scrotum. You're biologically male. I'm in many ways, I believe in biological realism, but I'm also not, a biological absolutist, or what's the term? I forget the term, but I don't believe that there are things you can't change or that you should be a slave to your biology. Obviously not. I've taken upon myself to change things in the pursuit of my own happiness. But if there are people online that I'm arguing with who are insisting that trans women are not biologically male, I'm going to correct them because they are.
I mean, it just seems to me that biology is more complicated than either you're male or either you're female. I think that, there's male picks out a cluster of attributes like your chromosomes, your hormones, your primary and secondary sexual anatomy. And it seems to me that once you've changed some of that, you're less of a biological male, at the very least, less of a biological male than you were. So I don't see, I feel that the insistence on binary terminology actually doesn't clarify things. But I also think this is maybe not the most important point here.
And honestly, I didn't even need to dig up that old debate because she also says it in her video.
Look, trans people can't even agree among ourselves what gender is. In fact, if you even try to answer the question, you end up enraging some part of the community who feels excluded. So no, trans people are not trying to force an ideology on people. We don't even share an ideology within our own community.
So I guess my point is some people do falsely believe that you're able to change your biological sex, and to pretend otherwise is to argue in bad faith. It is for this reason, however, because I'm gonna kind of share some points of agreement with Natalie before I continue on. This is the reason why I also dislike the phrase trans women are women, for essentially the same reasons that Natalie says, although I obviously disagree with her that intellectual debates are a form of indirect bigotry.
One way indirect bigotry works is by camouflaging political struggles as intellectual debates. When Joanne says sex is real, she sounds like she's staking out a position in the trans debate, which is then presented as an intellectual conflict about the metaphysics of gender, instead of what it really is, which is a political conflict about the social equality of transgender people. And the effectiveness of that strategy is actually a reason I'm not a huge fan of the slogan, trans women are women. It tends to invite the response, well, what does it even mean to be a woman? Define womanhood. And now, you're immediately getting baited into some bullshit semantic debate about what is a real woman. I personally like the slogan, trans liberation now. It's short, it's sweet, and instead of prompting, define womanhood, it prompts people to ask, what do you mean liberation? Liberation from what? And then you can say, well, I'll tell you. And now you're talking about politics instead of talking about semantics. Isn't that better?
And as for the last main point of agreement I have with Contrapoints is her assertion that the trans movement cares way too much about validating themselves and making sure everyone sees them as valid when that's not like a worthwhile political goal.
I feel like trans culture is just so obsessed with reassuring ourselves that we are valid that we sometimes forget that the end goal of a political movement is not validity, it's equality. That's what we're supposed to be fighting for.
But with that out of the way, I am going to go through her points mostly chronologically. Keep in mind that they get more contradictory, hostile, hypocritical, and authoritarian as time goes on, so this video will probably escalate. But to begin with, I really want to go in detail into Natalie's assertions and claims of what bigotry are to show how subjective they are, because as you'll see through the free speech section of my video, Contrapoints advocates against debating or having conversations with bigots and argues that you cannot change their minds, that they should be defeated, not persuaded, and takes a general pro-censorship stance. The irony is that the tactics she wants her audience to be hyper-vigilant towards can just as easily be used against her. And for that reason, I think it's really important to really dissect how subjective her views of bigotry are. This was a huge red flag for me when I very first watched that JK Rowling video.
There's really two different styles of bigotry. They express the same prejudice, but they're very different in tone. Whereas indirect bigotry manifests as concern.
Keep in mind, all of these points are very vague, with the first one being the most vague of all. What do you mean concern is indirect bigotry? You're concerned about transgender rights and defending them. Does that make you a bigot? This is very unclear.
Or debate about a host of proxy issues.
What do you define as proxy issues? You say yourself in your video that there are some issues that are worthy of debate, including trans women in sports.
Before I move on, I do want to clarify that I do think there are trans issues that are legitimately debatable by people who are not bigots. In my opinion, trans women in women's sports is one of those issues. It's often defensive in tone rather than offensive. The indirect bigot is always defending something, always a knight in shining armor, defending women, defending the children, defending marriage, defending freedom, defending the family, defending our values, defending common sense, defending tradition, defending civilization itself, defending God.
She stays on this one for a while, and again, it's a very vague one. She's defending plenty of things in her videos and on her channel. How do you distinguish what you're defending as bigotry or not? Do you just automatically think that if you're defending children and their health, this is just bigotry, period? I don't understand how this is something a bigot would do. This seems like something everyone does. Anyone who has values defends them.
Frequently the claim is that a once needed liberation movement has now gone too far, that it's now the activists who are the new oppressors, who are disturbing law and order with violent and chaotic protests.
So I can kill two birds with one stone on this one, because later on in her video, Contrapoints discusses how Eisenhower had to enforce the integration of Black students into mixed schools at gunpoint because of violent protesters, although of course she leaves out the violent protesters part. And through law and order, Eisenhower allowed this to happen in the face of extremely violent protesters who were like spitting on these people and committing acts of violence.
Do you people think that American schools were integrated because all the white people in the South were persuaded that segregation is bad? No, dum-dums. Eisenhower had to send in the 101st Airborne to enforce that shit at gunpoint.
And then of course she also states herself that sometimes activists go too far.
I've always been happy to acknowledge that angry trans people on Twitter sometimes take things too far. Things like death threats or misogynistic insults, I don't support that, and I've called it out in the past. Like when the leftist streamer Vosh, drama alert, who is not trans, tweeted at JK Rowling, "Women be quieter and start apologizing challenge." I called him out, who are victimizing and silencing innocent people by calling them bigots.
Honestly, I shouldn't even have to explain why defending free speech isn't bigotry, but that will be the entire crux of the last third to one half of this video, so I'll be discussing that at length.
Who are infiltrating the media and replacing good old-fashioned entertainment with politically correct propaganda.
So I don't know how she would support the claim that being against politically correct propaganda in the media would be a form of bigotry unless they were advocating for that to be censored or removed, because again, not allowing free speech is authoritarian. But Contrapoints in her own way sort of describes my issue with political correctness when she abstracts what indirect bigotry could look like.
Indirect bigotry often replaces the actual people it targets with some big abstract concept. Instead of Jewish people, they claim to be against Zionist-occupied government.
These euphemisms are perhaps anti-PC, but the abstraction method used is exactly what politically correct language does, and it's meant to both conceal the truth and prime people towards a particular political view.
The Skule!
And you lose a lot in language when you start using euphemisms for everything.
And of course, ordinary people are are too intimidated to speak out against it because cancel culture is out of control and free speech is under attack.
Natalie literally has an hour and 40-minute long video after she got canceled condemning cancel culture. But I guess because she reclaimed her belief in cancel culture in her most recent video, she's no longer a bigot. She's reformed.
Centrism has gone too far and I am now pro-cancel culture.
And so I didn't know anything about the Witch Trials of JK Rowling podcast until Natalie's video. Of course, I listened to it before making this video, and I was actually very pleased that this is the section that Megan Phelps Roper brought up to JK Rowling, as well as to Natalie herself, I believe, because it is by far the most concerning, and JK Rowling rightly says that this is an authoritarian mindset. And I'll explain more about that later because it seems like Natalie doesn't understand what people mean when they say that censoring free speech is authoritarian, that saying you can't have a debate or ask questions is authoritarian. She doesn't seem to understand what that means, so I will explain it later on. Overall, when it comes to the podcast, though, I actually do agree with the critics, the trans critics, and that I wish that she did push back a lot more on JK Rowling's beliefs and challenge her, and I wish it was like more fact-based as well. Like, I don't know. I actually agree. I wish there was more like dissenting voices and trans people involved in all of that, and I really wish JK Rowling was like challenged more. And then of course she describes intellectual debates as a form of indirect bigotry, which she really expands on when she starts talking about free speech at the end, which is just a full-blown anti-intellectual move and viewpoint. Natalie is a very smart woman. She has a lot of capabilities. I respect a lot of aspects of her content, but she is basically always taking the mainline progressive view, and right now the mainline progressive view is pretty anti-intellectual, which I've made an entire video about. And then her final point on what bigotry is and what I think that she thinks distinguishes her from all the other bigots, even though she shares the exact same views and beliefs as them because it's so subjective. This is what I think she tries to do mentally to distinguish herself from those people. She says,
being mean or rude or even abusive is not bigotry unless it's tied to a history of oppression or a backlash against a movement of equality.
But this is precisely J.K. Rowling's argument for being a radical feminist. There is a long history of biological females being oppressed by biological males, and because transgender people, as you've already said, are biological males, does that not justify her within your context? And then as for backlash against the movement of equality, one of the main ways that this ties in with the trans movement, of course, is the women in sports thing, which at least Natalie, to her credit, does discuss or say is open for debate. But my point here is not that I agree with JK Rowling or that I agree with Natalie's point. The point is to show how subjective it is. It can really be wielded for any sort of argument. And the reason that this is dangerous, again, is because when people are trying to censor other people or they care only about their ideological position, they tend to forget that the rules that they construct can just be as easily used against them, which if you're going to advocate for something like, I don't know, getting rid of the marketplace of ideas, this is extremely important and it will be used to oppress you. But before I get into the entire free speech argument, I want to focus on children transitioning first because that happens first in her video. And first I want to remind those who have seen Contrapoints videos that she agrees that facts can't be bigoted, but she basically assumes a moral character to using those facts to tell bigoted stories, apparently not realizing that bigoted stories against reasonable stories in the marketplace of ideas is how consensus is formed, it's how arguments are strengthened, it's how the truth is found, and usually the more low resolution sort of information we have on a topic, the more likely we are to take a bigoted view of it because we simply don't know much about it, which makes it scary, and people just kind of fill in the gaps with their own fears and anxieties. And so with that in mind, the fact that the arguments around facts are oftentimes what's being debated until more facts are present and we can make better, more clear inferences. Let's see how Natalie Wynn and JK Rowling construct arguments around the same sort of set of data.
In support of this speculation, Joanne rehashes a bunch of transphobic tropes about social contagion and a quote,
4,400% increase in girls being referred for transitioning treatment.
And that sounds pretty alarming, right? 4,400%. But you have to keep in mind that 10 years ago, only 32 assigned female patients under 18 were referred. And by last year, that number was 1,740, with the biggest increase happening 5 years ago, the transgender tipping point year. So that is a big increase, but it corresponds to the biggest ever increase in trans visibility, so it does make sense.
So those are the statistics that Natalie's responding to, with her argument being that the increase is due to increased trans acceptance. And I agree that that probably does play a role, maybe even a significant role, but I doubt that it plays the entire role. I also find the large discrepancy in the increase in girls transitioning versus boys very striking, especially given that since the widespread proliferation of social media, girls have reported the most vast increase in mental health issues more generally. Teenage girls are also the exact demographic most prone to social contagions because there have been different social contagions in history, including things like bulimia and cutting, and these things sort of cluster within friend groups, which is also what we're seeing in terms of girls who present with rapid onset gender dysphoria. I also think it's important to note that social media apps like TikTok have been associated with an increase in social contagion in terms of other illnesses, as well as like Tourette's. And then of course, anyone who knows children, and especially teenagers really, they're very impressionable. They care a lot about their identity and trying on different identities, and they also care a lot about fitting in and gaining acceptance. And then of course, the post-pubertal period, especially for women, absolute worst. Your body changes drastically, people treat you very differently. It's very normal for a woman to be very dysmorphic at this time, whether or not it's gender dysphoria. And with the severe increase in body image issues that we're seeing with social media and girls' mental health, because they do compare themselves so much to others online, I feel like this probably has an impact as well. I think there's a variety of reasons. I don't think it's simply trans acceptance, even though that probably did play a role. But let's see what else Natalie has to say on this.
And there's 11 million children in the UK, so let's say 5.5 million girls and 1,740 is 0.03% of that. And considering that around 1% of adults are some kind of transgender, 0.03% of kids is not really an alarming number to me.
And that is a small number overall, although similar increases have been reported in other first world countries, and the rate at which it's growing is pretty intense. I mean, it's normal for people to take note and speculate on what's happening. But I do find it interesting when people say like, oh, that number is too small to worry about. And then when you see that up to 10% of those people are going to detransition, and we only know very short-term data on this because this vast increase in girls we haven't seen the long-term effects of. When people are like, oh, we should ignore detransitioners, they happen to make a mistake, whatever. It's not really reflective of like the greater problem because it fits their ideology. But then also when it comes to an even smaller minority of detransitioners and trans children, the tiny, tiny, tiny minority of those people who commit suicide, this is used as the primary reason why children transitioning should be allowed, because if you don't, they are literally going to kill themselves. You're enacting trans genocide, regardless of the fact that you're literally sterilizing trans people so they can't reproduce. Basically, if you're going to say that the numbers are too small to worry about, and this is not to Natalie specifically, this is trans activists more generally, don't make your only argument for children transitioning the idea that they might commit suicide otherwise. And to me, it just reminds me of the classic emotional abuse tactic of when you break up with someone and they threaten to kill themselves. So that way you'll stay and you'll give them what they want. And by the way, so far, all the data and statistics on trans kids killing themselves because they can't get treatment is extremely faulty. It's not evidence. Not to mention the fact that alongside this recent increase, which is why healthcare professionals are very concerned, the people referred usually have multiple psychiatric ailments, all of which of course correspond with an increased risk in suicide. Autistic girls in particular are overrepresented, and obviously autistic people have a much higher rate of suicide. And the general suicide rate for teenage girls has been rising exponentially since social media in the general population. Sorry about the vocab slip-ups. There are also, of course, conflicting studies on whether or not that suicide risk goes down post-transition because, I mean, this is a hard pill to swallow, I guess, for a lot of people. Unless your only issue is gender dysphoria, transitioning is not going to make you happy. If you have other issues going on, it's still going to be there. And then, of course, when you take into consideration a lot of these girls are probably lesbian, gay, or bisexual, those also, of course, have their own elevated suicide risk. So I do think there's a social contagion element to this, even if Natalie tries to smear it as being a Hitler talking point. But I do also believe that there are obviously people whose gender dysphoria lasts into adulthood, and I think people should be able to transition when they reach adulthood. But again, because kids can't sterilize to sex or tattoos or drinking or getting their tubes tied or a vasectomy, anything like that, I don't understand how people think that they can consent to making these irreversible changes to their body. And then, since Natalie gives some historical lessons later on, I guess I'll drop a couple here. Let's not forget that medical establishments aren't the end-all be-all of authority. They don't always know what's right, particularly when it comes to LGBT people and mentally ill people. Think about lobotomies. That was utilized for a long time for psychiatric patients with obviously terrible effects, but they truly thought that it was a cure. Let's also not forget that with taxpayer money, the NHS literally chemically castrated gay men to try and fix their homosexuality, since that was considered a mental illness. This most notably, of course, happened to Alan Turing. So I bring that up again to just stress that you can't always trust authorities. Like, people are very much making appeals to authority left and right these days, more so than I've ever seen. And it's just important to remember that the medical establishment isn't always right. Although they are righting their wrongs recently, which I'll get into in like 25 seconds probably. But first, let's go into Natalie's interpretation of why people are concerned about this uptick in child transitions, which is that she thinks it's transphobic.
Whereas I feel like transmasculine people are less vilified, but so infantilized. I guess transphobes view trans men as women, so a lot of misogynistic tropes still apply. So much for transitioning to escape sexism. The story is often that these vulnerable, confused girls can't possibly decide for themselves what to do with their own bodies, so the courts must intervene to take control. Which is exactly what just happened in the UK, where trans youth under 16 will now need not only the approval of a doctor, but will need to seek a court order in order to get puberty blockers.
And funny enough, if you're into dark humor, I guess, is that the clinic that she references actually shut down due to an internal investigation showing that youth were rushed into hormone therapy and other medical procedures with barely any safeguarding or proper therapy first, which is why detransitioners and their families are suing the clinic. There have been whistleblowers here in the US saying the same thing. There's a lot going on with this issue right now, here in the United States even. Other progressive countries that the left normally looks to as being superior to us on most issues, but apparently not this one, such as Sweden, Finland, and Norway, have dialed back or banned gender transition on children due to the sudden increase in females with comorbid mental health issues, and of course due to a strong lack of scientific evidence that the iatrogenic effects of these drugs are worth it, particularly when it comes to children. This really is a medical experiment, and I am like a libertarian when it comes to bodily autonomy, okay? I think prostitution should be decriminalized, all of that kind of thing. I think if you're an adult, you should be allowed to make changes to your body for any reason. So if you want to take on these hormones and get these surgeries not knowing the long-term effects, if you're an adult, I think you have the right to do that. I think you should have the right to do that. But putting this on children who can't consent to anything else really, who are constantly trying different identities, who have comorbid psychiatric problems, who aren't getting proper therapy or other tools to deal with what they're dealing with before resorting to surgical transition, the idea that these kids should be experimented on makes zero sense to me. I don't understand how that's ethical, and I don't understand how people support this. People aren't infantilizing trans teenagers because they're misogynistic. They're infantilizing them because they're children.
And the justification given for this mirrored exactly Joanne's concerns about fragile, vulnerable teenage girls being unable to make informed decisions.
But I'm curious to hear other people's opinions on this. Sorry for getting heated. I'll probably get more heated in the next section. But I'm curious to know other people's thoughts on this. I certainly think it should be in the marketplace of ideas. It should be debatable. This should not be a banned topic. But my view, as I said, is that children can't consent to this. If you think there are special cases in which they can, feel free to talk about it down below. I know some of these countries do still allow treatment and surgery towards people, but it's much more specific and difficult to get. But speaking about debatable issues and how nothing should be off limits, let's get into Natalie's views on free speech and illiberal methods. So Natalie becomes increasingly hypocritical, contradictory, and condescending throughout this section. But something that's very apparent throughout the rest of her video is her apparent lack of understanding of the purpose and utility of the marketplace of ideas. And this will become increasingly clear as the video goes on, but to begin with, I guess I'll just briefly explain what the marketplace of ideas is and why it's important. So the marketplace of ideas is a metaphor used to justify free speech, especially for minority views. And it's essentially the basis of freedom, freedom from oppression and tyranny, because the first way to an authoritarian government or dictatorship is not being allowed to think or speak freely. And this idea basically justifies the existence of democracy. And the idea is that no speech should be censored because even bigoted or extreme or radical views can be reasoned through as long as there isn't censorship or interference. It's idealistic in the sense that it assumes that reason is something that people value and can be used to disprove and abandon bad ideas. But to quote Thomas Jefferson in his inaugural address, error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is free to combat it. Without this right to free speech, governments can censor dissidents through authoritarian measures, which can lead a society to collapse because new and inventive improvements can't openly be discussed and tinkered with in order to create a more robust system. And if it wasn't for free speech and open debate and the marketplace of ideas, minority views that were once seen as radical, such as gay people should have the right to marry, could immediately be censored and suppressed by majority consensus, rather than be open for debate and tinkering until eventually the majority adopts this view. And this right necessarily can't discriminate on the basis of ideas, including ideas that we now deem to be bigoted, through the privilege of having reasoned through them in this marketplace, which, to quote Thomas Jefferson again, he says, "All too will bear in mind the sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possesses their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression." In this sense, both TERFs and trans activists are able to express their opinions and ideas, even if the majority finds one or both of these movements to be bigoted. But let's see now Natalie's introduction to this topic.
Is canceling ever warranted? Is it right to condemn racism, homophobia, and misogyny? Or should we allow spokespeople for these prejudices a respected position in the free marketplace of ideas, where we can all sit around debating the legitimacy of gay marriage or the possible merits of a white ethno-state? Is the final solution a myth promulgated by the international Jew? Are yoga pants to blame for sexual violence? Wouldn't the taxpayer save a lot of money if there weren't so many disabled people? Who knows? These are open questions. Let's sit down with people on both sides, on many sides, and have calm, civil conversations about it for the rest of our goddamn lives.
So she poses this as a rhetorical question, and obviously the answer to the question is yes. But Natalie seems to imply that her answer to this question is no, which will become more evident as time goes on. But the irony here is that the reason that gay marriage and the merits of a white ethno-state and all of this aren't at the forefront of debate in this open marketplace is not because people have censored those ideas or anything like that. It's because they've already been reasoned through and reasonable conclusions have been made on them. While people are free to bring these topics up again for debate, the majority has already moved on. And if those arguments become more robust arguments will also occur to sort of dismantle that. But right now, there isn't a majority consensus on all kinds of trans issues, which is why it's still at the forefront of the debate, whereas things like, is the final solution real? Aren't. Only weird ideologues are still arguing that, and because the rest of us have reason and evidence and facts and all of this to disprove it, no one pays too much mind to those people. And I'll show a lot more evidence that Natalie doesn't believe in the marketplace of ideas as time goes on, but first let's see how she introduces Megan Phelps Roper and her idea that even bigots should be met with compassion and empathy if we want their minds to be changed, because that's what led her to being de-radicalized from the Westboro Baptist Church.
She's totally right that if you want to change people's minds, then approaching them with compassion and empathy is usually the best way to do that. But Megan reaches another conclusion that I don't agree with, which is that because compassion and civil conversation are most likely to persuade people, we should never cancel anyone, even the most horrible bigots. And canceling is a pretty meaningless term at this point.
And while Megan doesn't explicitly define what she means by canceling, I think it's fair to assume that she means censorship, given that the podcast is hosted by a free speech advocacy group, and that every single episode begins with her saying that free speech is the bedrock of democracy, and
many argue that the right to free speech is too dangerous, and that even listening to ideological opponents is morally wrong. Many people just don't see a problem with using the law, corporate power, and even extraordinary social pressure to censor viewpoints they disagree with.
What she absolutely never says, however, are the words that Natalie is about to put in her mouth when she strawmans her excessively and heavily, so let's watch that.
But what Megan means is we shouldn't say mean things to bigots. We shouldn't boycott or counter-protest or raise our voices. We shouldn't shun or exclude anyone, because that's just not how you change minds.
So she never says any of that, but I think you could fairly assume that when she says extreme social sanctions, she does mean shunning, which is something that Contrapoints advocates for, shunning people, which I'll get into later. But otherwise, this is a total straw man, and then she says this about Megan's viewpoint.
The problem is, Megan's views about this only make sense if you assume that Megan is the main character of reality. If you assume that the moral improvement of bigots is more important than protecting the people they target. Or if you assume that changing bigots' minds is the only way to make social progress. which it isn't.
Okay, so number one, of course, her podcast is going to be shaped by her views, just like your YouTube channel is shaped by your views, and just like my YouTube channel is shaped by my views. I don't understand your implication here. And number two, Megan has never said that the moral improvement of bigots is better than protecting the people they target, or that changing bigots' minds is the only way to make social progress. This is another straw man, which is Natalie's favorite rhetorical tactic. And third, because Megan has never said that targeted groups shouldn't be protected by the law or against violence or anything like that, and that Megan's sole legal argument in her podcast is on protecting and advocating for free speech, we can assume that by protecting the people bigots target, Natalie means protecting them from speech that they don't like, rather than from anything else, which is clearly a pro-censorship argument, and this will become more clear in a second. So while Natalie showed earlier examples of bigots being persuaded through compassion and reason to become de-radicalized, and states that compassion and empathy are the best way to change people's minds, she then says it's better to persuade other people to ignore people that they don't agree with, based on Natalie's subjective notions of bigotry.
De-radicalization is a valid strategy, but it cannot be the only strategy, and it must not be the primary strategy. In general, I think that the massive effort that it takes to maybe persuade bigots is better spent persuading other people not to listen to them.
And now let's watch her advocate against the importance of questioning your own ideology.
In the case of Megan Phelps Roper, I don't know if she has lingering bigoted sentiments, but what she does have is a kind of hypervigilant skepticism about anything she perceives as ideology. This is pretty common with people who used to be religious fundamentalists. They were so certain they were right, only to realize that everything they believed about the world is wrong. So they become distrustful of any strong moral convictions because it reminds them of their former fanaticism.
Coming from Westboro, where I believed so strongly that I was doing the right thing, and then to leave and come to believe that it was so destructive and harmful, I had this moment in time, and it lasted for many months, where I was like, how can I ever trust my own mind again?
This kind of skepticism is in some ways a good impulse, but valuing dispassionate intellectualism above all else can cause problems, especially where topics of social justice are concerned. Because it can lead you to this kind of toxic centrism that asks, why are marginalized people so unwilling to have calm, philosophical debates about whether they should have rights? Are they afraid of dangerous ideas?
More on this in a second, but the idea that social justice shouldn't allow for dispassionate intellectualism or shouldn't value intellectualism over other means of getting what you want is a problem, because it means that rights and privileges shouldn't be granted through reason in a liberal democracy, but should be granted by other means, of which kind we'll see later on. But first, let's watch her strawman Sam Harris and then denigrate anyone who does have civil conversations about their rights.
Sam Harris, in his podcast about Megan's podcast, complained that trans activism and activism in general is plagued by mental illness and hysteria.
I frankly think there's a fair degree of mental instability and even frank mental illness in the activist community. I mean, in really in all activist communities, the level of viciousness and hysteria is, it's hard to know what to compare it to.
Diversity win. Man accuses trans women of being hysterical. Is it really hysteria to react with strong emotions when your basic inclusion in society is up for debate? Aren't there certain situations where strong emotions are warranted?
Where do I even begin with this? First of all, Sam Harris isn't calling trans women hysterical. He says all activist groups have elements of hysteria to them. He also explicitly says that Natalie Wynn is reasonable and that he was subscribed to her Patreon years ago. She is categorically not included with who he is talking about.
Talking to so many other people, it made me realize there is actually a lot of space for it, but it doesn't seem that way because of this very distorting effects of places like Twitter.
Yeah, and you've found some reasonable people who are quite critical of Rowling too. I mean, I'm recalling the trans woman Natalie Wynn, otherwise known as Contrapoints on YouTube. And when I was on Patreon, I used to support her channel, although I sort of lost touch with it in recent years. So it was nice to hear her again. But she's very critical of Rowling, but she's, I don't know how much you spoke to her, but in terms of what made it into your podcast, she seems quite reasonable. So I wouldn't put her on the far fringe of this activist culture that is showing these kind of cult-like and puritanical traits.
The hysterical people he's describing are the most extreme trans activists, like, I don't know, the ones who canceled you 3 years ago for using a voiceover segment by a trans person that they didn't like. Like, you can't admit that there's some kind of mob mentality to these sort of social justice campaigns.
It has all the, this is why the witch burning analogy is so appropriate. I mean, it really has a cult-like hysteria about it, where there's the scapegoating of heretics, there are blasphemy tests, there's just, no one is far left enough to be immune to being, castigated by the mob if they make one wrong move. Maybe so Natalie Wynn herself was attacked by the trans community for not aligning with every one of its points of piety.
And then it's also interesting how Contrapoints says, is it really hysteria when your basic rights are up for debate? When she already admitted that certain aspects of the trans issues are up for debate, like trans women in sports. And then finally, Sam Harris never said that there weren't situations in which strong emotions are warranted. This is completely putting words into his mouth. But let's move on to her condemnation of calm and civil conversations, even though she earlier said that this is the best way to change bigots' minds.
It reminds me of this awful episode of Joe Rogan feat. Ben Shapiro, where Lil Benny argues that gay marriage is immoral with his usual whining sophistry, and Joe gently raises objections for Ben to talk circles around. All of the top comments on this video are like this.
Imagine talking about different beliefs while still having a productive conversation. Things progress when you don't demonize people.
The discussion here was excellent. Two guys with opposing opinions, speaking calmly and intellectually without cursing, shouting and making disparaging comments about each other. This is how it should be done. Kudos to both of them.
Joe is a great interviewer. He can totally disagree with someone and still have a calm, collective conversation. This is how it should be. Just two people sharing ideas, learning different point of views from each other. This is why Joe is the #1 podcast.
And yeah, it's easy for two straight men to have a dispassionate, theoretical conversation about the ethics of homosexuality because it's not their lives and their relationships that are up for debate. These people don't understand the emotional burden placed on marginalized people who are asked to defend their rights.
And you might think, oh, okay, Natalie has a point here, these people aren't directly affected by the ruling on gay marriage, unless they, of course, like most people, have friends and family, etc., who are gay. Maybe it is unfair for people to be calm when it's their rights that they're discussing, even though I think the congratulatory nature of the comments would apply to any debate, because people get heated over the most minor things that have nothing to do with them, like whether or not a certain celebrity is attractive or not. But don't worry, she then goes on to condemn the marginalized people who do have calm and civil conversations about their rights, because there's really no winning.
Dave Rubin is a gay conservative whose career requires that he convince his right-wing audience that he's one of the good ones. This means that he's willing to sit across from his so-called friend, homophobe Ben Shapiro, and listen to Ben say he would never attend his anniversary party because it would be tantamount to endorsing sin. The two of them then congratulate themselves about how they can still be great friends. And here's Dave having a civil conversation with conservative Glenn Beck, who compares homosexuality to alcoholism and then congratulates himself on having the conversation. I think a lot of straight people look at Dave Rubin and they see, finally, a reasonable gay person who doesn't scream bigot at everyone who disagrees and can actually have a civil conversation. But that's not what I see. I look at Dave Rubin and I see a spineless, bootlicking doormat who won't even defend his own family from the most fundamental disrespect.
But Dave Rubin is a gay man, so let's watch an instance of a trans woman calmly debating her rights, I guess you could call them, with Ben Shapiro, which Natalie apparently thought was good enough to include in her video on pronouns in order to teach around. So I guess I'll show that.
But unlike the debate about gay marriage, the question about trans womanhood is more than just a political and legal dispute. It seems to me that whatever church, state, and Merriam-Webster decide, trans women already are and will continue to be women. And to see why, I want to elaborate on an argument posed to Ben Shapiro by my sometime rival Blair White. Yes, even though she's one of the YouTubers whomst is bad. The debate begins with Ben Shapiro asserting his usual position that pronouns are used to designate so-called biological men and biological women. Blair responds by observing that Ben's way of using pronouns is in her case completely impractical.
And you had to tell, the host I'm here to meet my friend Blair. And they said, okay, and you had to describe me to take me to the table. You wouldn't say the man in the orange shirt, you would say Blair, you would say her over there.
Ben then responds saying,
I think there's some truth to that, meaning that I think that there is a utility to the use of pronouns, but that's not quite the same as suggesting that a transgender woman is a she in the objective sense.
And Blair responds to that with what I think is a very good analogy.
For instance, if someone were to adopt children, there's no biological basis for calling them that kid's parents, because they're not. Like, they're just literally not. There's no link at all biologically, but there is a social reason to do it, and there's a legal reason to do it.
Just when Ben seems on the cusp of having a breakthrough, he and Blair pause their argument to congratulate themselves on how civil their discussion is.
From what I've seen, a lot of your interactions with trans people, they always end up kind of ugly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. When people start yelling at each other or tweeting out F you, that's not a great way to change my mind. It turns out that's not particularly convincing.
So overall, she seems to be against calmly debating topics that don't involve you, as well as calmly debating topics that do involve you, because that makes you a doormat and a bootlicker, leaving the only proper way to engage in a debate being hysterical. She then dismisses logical reasoning and getting people to change their minds by saying this.
There's often an erotic component to persuasion, and that certainly seems to be the case with Megan, because one of the people who helped de-radicalize her is now her husband. And I feel like that's a relevant detail if we're trying to understand the role of reason and emotion in de-radicalization experiences. I think this experience is usually more akin to religious conversion than it is to logical reasoning.
So she's kind of telling on herself here because Contrapoints made her name de-radicalizing the alt-right with her videos, so she's essentially admitting that rather than having logical videos, it's more about persuading people religiously to join her side, and that logic only plays a very small role, which I guess is apparent given this recent video that she made, but it also doesn't explain the other de-radicalization instances she mentions in her video, such as the Unite the Right guy, as well as the guy who got 200 members of the KKK to be de-radicalized, unless all 200 of those guys wanted to fuck him maybe, which no judgment if that's the case. But in my opinion, fanaticism and religious conversion may be enough, and usually is the case of getting people to go from one extreme to another. I don't think it's the case usually for people who become very skeptical about things and ask questions and are more removed from an ideology than being a true believer in one. So in that sense, I think reason and conversation play a larger role than Natalie gives them credit for. And then she says this.
There's also a world of difference between the mostly private conversations that actually lead people to reflect on their beliefs and the spectacle of public debate.
Which completely nullifies the point of Contrapoints' channel because she's always been involved in debates, maybe not as much anymore, but the bulk of her videos involve multiple characters debating different issues so that way the audience can learn about these different forms of arguments. And her comment section is usually full of people being like, oh, you totally changed my mind about XYZ, I didn't think about it like that before, and so on and so forth. I think public debates can be a useful springboard for further research and also kind of serves as a mouthpiece for how sort of solidified a current ideology or belief is at a given time. But let's see some more of Natalie's arguments against public debate and the marketplace of ideas.
Public debate is one way that we define the limits of the Overton window, the range of beliefs that is socially acceptable to hold. So often people who want to promote bigotry will use debate as a foot in the door. It's a way of establishing that their prejudices are within the realm of reasonable and socially accepted opinion.
So first of all, if an idea is already outside of the Overton window, yeah, it's going to have to be brought into and adopted by other people through a lot of argumentation, hopefully including reason and logic, because radical ideas are usually immediately dismissed unless there's some element that should be dug out further from it. An idea isn't going to be seen as reasonable and socially acceptable just because one person is arguing it. And while yes, a lot of bigoted ideas can become to seem socially acceptable and reasonable over time before hopefully in the terms of progress eventually being overturned. This is also how all progressive ideas become, the center of everything, because all of those ideas also start out as radical that people are afraid of and want to shut down immediately, but because they hold certain grains of truth and whatnot, that's able to be fleshed out until certain elements of it are adopted by wider society. Also, simply refusing to debate or acknowledge an idea or give it airtime will cause that idea, if enough people agree with it, to fester and become strong enough and debated anyways, and this time you're not even going to be involved in it, and it could become totally unreasonable and ideological and extreme. Like, debates will happen whether or not you're engaging with them. But let's see what Natalie has to say about what she assumes to be a contradictory stance on deplatforming.
In the witch trials of JK Rowling, Jo takes a contradictory stance on deplatforming. She brings up right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos, saying that activists are making a strategic error and giving Milo power by protesting his events, making him look dangerous and sexy. But when trans people try to deplatform TERFs, Rowling characterizes this as silencing. So is deplatforming a strategic error that gives power to your opponent? Or is it a powerful tactic of silencing?
Okay, so this is a question I definitely feel comfortable asking because I've made this exact argument on my YouTube channel like 2 years ago, and I still stand by that. So number one, deplatforming in this instance, yeah, this actually was censorship. These violent protests erupted. Milo couldn't speak. It was like a canceled event. In that sense, he was literally silenced. A lot of academics as well, not just internet trolls, have been silenced on college campuses. They've been removed for their own safety and not allowed to speak because of violence and extreme protesters. And so violence in this form is a form of censorship. Just because it's not enacted by a government doesn't mean it's not silencing. But on the other hand, because there are different outlets people have to speak, people who see something like this violent protest are like, wow, what is this guy saying that's causing this reaction? And then they go and try to find what he's saying. It gives a lot more power to his arguments. And most people who value freedom are inherently suspicious when a group of people is saying that you can't listen to a certain argument or idea, because what that asserts is that this idea and argument is so convincing that if you heard it, you would immediately be convinced. Because if it was completely ridiculous, people would just brush it off as completely ridiculous. So when JK Rowling says that TERFs are silenced because activists are pounding on all the walls and disrupting meetings and so on, she is being correct. But she is clearly also correct that this behavior gives a lot of ammunition to the other side, because now she has a 7-hour podcast that I'm talking about and you're talking about and all these people are talking about, and everyone's wondering what is a TERF and what are her ideas, what did you say that's so crazy? The censorship has truly given her platform so much esteem. If she had sent out a transphobic tweet and everyone literally just ignored it, or there was a reasonable debate in which she was clearly on the losing side, people would have moved on and ignored it, and it wouldn't be like how it is right now. And if the people at Berkeley either didn't show up to Milo's event or showed up and calmly debated him, the world probably would have moved on, and we definitely wouldn't be having this conversation right now. I feel like I've talked about Milo Yiannopoulos on my channel like 4 times now. But then Natalie says something that I do agree with.
Rowling seems to think that the trans rights movement is dangerous and authoritarian in some unprecedented way that makes it different from all past liberation movements. But how? What are these illiberal methods that distinguish trans rights activism from similar past movements? Canceling? Anita Bryant was way more cancelled than JK Rowling ever will be. Boycotts? Boycotts have been a staple of every progressive movement in modern history. Disrupting feminist meetings? Disrupting feminist meetings is a feminist tradition.
And while I don't think JK Rowling said that this trans stuff is unprecedented from any sort of movement of the past, I certainly understand why it was interpreted that way, and it is true, like Natalie says, that a lot of activist movements have used violence and illiberal methods in the past. And people still use violence and activism today, although I kind of feel like Natalie wouldn't exactly support people bombing abortion clinics, people who are anti-abortion and whatnot. I kind of feel like Natalie's pros or cons on these sort of activities depend on her own personal beliefs. But she then goes on to describe feminist meetings of the past, saying,
"So just as the meeting was beginning, a group of 17 lesbians wearing Lavender Menace t-shirts switched off the lights, pulled the plug on the mic, and charged down the aisles laughing and screaming. Their leader, Rita Mae Brown, took the mic and yelled, 'This conference won't proceed until we talk about lesbians and the women's movement.' So the Lavender Menace disrupted the feminist meeting using illiberal tactics, not because they were against feminism, but because they wanted lesbian exclusionary feminists to include them. It's the same thing that's happening today when trans people disrupt feminist meetings, as JK Rowling puts it, interestingly neglecting to mention which feminist meetings these are."
And I don't see why Natalie thinks the fact that these activists wanted to be included in these lesbian exclusive feminist meetings matters at all, unless she's asserting that if someone wants to belong to your group, you should allow them to use illiberal methods to do so. But her support for this also seems to go against something that she said earlier.
In general, I think that the massive effort that it takes to maybe persuade bigots is better spent persuading other people not to listen to them.
But obviously, overall, I agree with Natalie's point that illiberal methods are not exclusive to the trans community, and also there is a lot of violent rhetoric that TERFs throw at trans people and vice versa, and the podcast doesn't really show any of the stuff that the TERFs have said, which is definitely a valid criticism, especially for a podcast that claims to see all sides. And then she brings up some extremes of the feminist movement.
But this exact technique has been used against literally every liberation movement in world history. For example, let's consider Reclaim the Night, the protest movement against sexual violence in Britain, which first got JK Rowling interested in feminism in the 1970s. Here's how The Guardian, Britain's spineless centrist paper of note, covered a Reclaim the Night protest in 1979. Chanting slogans against rape seems reasonable to promote awareness, but what about the hissing and swearing at any innocent male, and cries of castrate men? The protesters were allegedly singing, "Here I stand, my knife in hand, free castration on demand." So this is how the British press covered the women's movement. Angry, torch-bearing women screaming, "Castrate men!" Now, is that a fair representation of the women's movement? Should we judge every movement by its most militant extremists? Is it fair, say, to pretend that Valerie Solanas, who shot Andy Warhol, who advocated for male extermination in her Society for Cutting Up Men manifesto, is representative of feminism as a whole? Many anti-feminists over the years have done exactly that. But it's not fair, is it? So why does JK Rowling think it's fair to judge the trans movement by the worst things trans people have ever tweeted?
But overall, I do agree with Natalie that we shouldn't judge movements by their worst actors. I will remind my audience, however, that Contrapoints seems to say that the only valid form of debate is hysterical actions and motives, which does align with these castrate men feminists. So to me, it seems like she wants this sort of hysterical behavior to be representative of the trans movement, but maybe I'm just reading too much into it. I'm sure if these feminists debated their rights with men calmly, they would be spineless, boot-licking doormats. So now let's get into some of the half-truths that Contrapoint says when it comes to illiberal methods being used to get what people want.
In the 4th episode of The Witch Trials of JK Rowling, Megan interviews New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, who has written sympathetically about transphobic feminism. There's a moment in this interview where Michelle kind of stumbles into an honest observation that I find fascinating.
Right. I mean, I think you'll often hear people say, you know, I'm not going to debate my basic humanity. And part of the difficulty is that there are indeed certain issues which we have sort of decided somewhat collectively with some sort of consensus are beyond the realm of debate. And I think that part of what is so difficult about this issue is that there's certain people who think that this kind of consensus can be imposed maybe as opposed to evolve organically. And so they're sort of desperately trying to shore it up in the hopes, I think, that if they can, they will enjoy the same sort of assumed protection as other groups whose rights we've decided are not up for public conversation. I think the problem is that we don't actually have a consensus.
So Michelle correctly observes that the reason trans people are often reluctant to debate our rights is that we want the same assumed protections as other groups whose rights liberals have decided are not up for debate. But then, Michelle suggests that trans people have to debate our rights because there isn't a mainstream consensus that we deserve rights. I am really curious to know how Michelle Goldberg thinks that past liberation movements have succeeded. Like, does she think that women's suffrage just evolved organically? Did suffragettes just have calm, civil conversations about whether women are intellectually capable of voting until all the misogynists were rationally persuaded? No, they stood up and demanded their right to vote, sometimes violently, especially in the UK.
And then she goes on to describe domestic terrorism and the feminist movement in the UK.
Like, people forget this, maybe because they were called suffragettes, which is kind of a cutesy name, but the suffragettes, they murdered people. They were suffragette terrorists. They broke windows, they bombed churches, they set fire to a theater. In 1909, a suffragette attacked Winston Churchill with a horsewhip. Queen shit, honestly. The English suffragette Mary Lee threw a fucking hatchet at the Prime Minister's head.
Alright, so I know that was like some long clips, and I'm not familiar personally with like UK politics. I'm very American-centric because A lot of Americans are. But Natalie's assertion here seems to be that violence can bring about change and that trans people shouldn't have to debate any of their rights. They should be imposed on others. Even though she also goes on to say that she doesn't advocate for violence because it's not effective, which seems contradictory to her earlier implications and will be contradictory to her implications later on.
And my point is not to advocate terrorism or to excuse the terrorism of past movements. I think these kinds of tactics have tended to turn people against the movement. I don't think it's effective, but let's not pretend that past movements have never made demands before everyone was ready.
But she does make it sound like feminists demanded their rights and used violence to impose them on others rather than gaining any sort of consensus, which is simply not true. Women's suffrage was an extremely long movement, and it did rely on consensus, at least from representatives and the Senate and so on, to pass. And outside of violence or censorship, protests and boycotts and the like are not illiberal forms of protest. That's perfectly valid within free speech. But women's rights were something that was voted on, and it was something that they therefore had to persuade others to believe in, even if they didn't have to persuade the technical majority. She then gives the exact argument that I give and that everyone gives in regards to free speech and why it's so important.
In fact, marginalized groups wouldn't need rights if there was a consensus that we deserve rights. The whole reason to have rights is to protect you from the kind of people who think you shouldn't have them.
When it comes to constitutional rights, these exist regardless of majority consensus, including free speech. If the majority of people were against a certain form of speech, it wouldn't matter because the Supreme Court would still rule it as okay and acceptable speech, at least for the time being. And there are plenty of other rights that have been granted as constitutionally viable by the Supreme Court, regardless of majority consensus within the different states, which I'll get into in a second. But let's continue on with what Natalie has to say about this.
I mean, it's a nice thought that we can just politely persuade everyone to give us rights, but the reality is, that's not how this works, and it never has been.
Okay, so the first point that people have never gained rights by persuading others is just patently incorrect. A lot of states implemented gay marriage by majority vote before the Supreme Court ruled in people's favor and allowed it everywhere. And to use another example, because abortion is no longer protected by the Constitution and the Supreme Court, it's now up to states to vote on that matter, so people do have to have a majority consensus on whether or not they allow this procedure. And therefore, when it comes to protecting that right, it does matter to have voters on your side and a majority consensus on your side.
Do you people think that American schools were integrated because all the white people in the South were persuaded that segregation is bad? No, dum-dums. Eisenhower had to send in the 101st Airborne to enforce that shit at gunpoint.
She was correct in bringing up desegregation, however. The majority of people in the South were against that. There were extremely violent protests, which is why the state had to self-defend those people to bring them to school. There are rights protected by the Constitution that are won through court cases, which in my opinion are liberal means. And those rights, such as the right to free speech, are extremely important, again, because they exist regardless of majority consensus. And so in that sense, she's definitely correct.
Like, how do these debate me centrists think that slavery ended in the United States? Well, between 1861 and 1865, there was a little event called the American Civil Debate. See what I'm holding in my hand? This is a high-caliber idea that I picked off the polite discussion field of Manassas.
And so when it comes to the Civil War, obviously this is a very extreme example. And first of all, there were so many debates on this, on slavery before the war broke out. And those debates did obviously allow people to become abolitionists or to solidify their beliefs, because through reason and dialogue, they're able to sort of make up their own minds on the issue. But when so-called centrists like Megan Phelps Roper complain about political polarization, something that I also complain about a lot, this is what they mean. It's because we don't want our country to get into a civil war. We don't want to become so polarized that we have a civil war. This should absolutely be a last case scenario. Violence should be a last case scenario, but war especially. And I don't know about you, but I personally hope that our country doesn't get into a civil war over trans people using the bathroom, because that would be extremely embarrassing. I think before we burst out into violence, we should try to sway majority consensus on certain trans issues, what we should do about them, what laws should be enacted. When it comes to the ones that are constitutionally protected, that should be argued obviously through court cases and with the Supreme Court and all of that, because those can be imposed regardless of majority consensus. But for the time being, yes, trans people have to debate their rights, just like gay people had to debate their rights, just like women had to debate their rights, both of whose rights you are resting on the laurels of. there are certain rights that have been granted by people before you that you get to have as a result. For instance, in terms of marriage equality and the right to vote. To me, though, it seems like you're advocating for simply imposing your rights on others, even through illiberal methods, even if you say that you don't condone violence and that it's not effective. Which, to the audience watching who isn't aware of Contrapoints, I truly think her channel name is a portmanteau of contradictory viewpoints because those exist in so many of her videos. She is constantly nullifying her own arguments if you listen closely enough, and she doesn't technically advocate for anything. A lot of her videos are pure aesthetic, which I'm not against. I mean, her videos are very artistic and I like them, and some of her videos are amazing. Like her video on incels, I think deserves a Peabody. It's like probably the best video on YouTube. So empathetic, such a great video. But she is very wishy-washy in a lot of her arguments a lot of the times because she completely contradicts herself over and over again. But let's move on to Contrapoints' concluding thoughts in this video, which I'll try to be more sympathetic to.
In the 2020s, anti-trans bigotry has become a keystone of Conservative Party platforms, both in the UK, where Lee Anderson, deputy chair of the Conservative Party, predicts that the next election will be won on
probably a mixture of culture wars and trans debate,
and in the US, where the ACLU is currently tracking more than 450 anti-LGBT bills, including more than 130 gender-affirming care bans, 51 trans sports bans, 40 drag bans, 29 trans bathroom bans, and 21 bans defining trans people out of the law. Republicans have escalated anti-trans rhetoric to eliminationist extremes that have most trans people in this country living in a constant state of fear for our future.
So most of these bills are on youth transition, which, as we've established, I think should be a debatable issue. Obviously, the next biggest issue is trans women in sports, which Natalie has already said it should be legitimately debatable by people who are not bigots. And then the drag bans, I believe, will be ruled unconstitutional fairly quickly because you cannot suppress an adult's right to dress how they want. This is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And I'll make a future video on how the right doesn't care about free speech either, because they really be out here trying to ban books and shit. But as for the rest of the bills, I'm not going to pretend like I've read every single one of them. I've tried to find like an archive of all of them, and I've read a lot of them, but it's actually kind of hard to like find them all. You think they'd all be conglomerated somewhere so you could go through easily, but no. But it is upsetting that the rhetoric around all these bills is as anti-trans. It's kind of like a smear thing because a lot of them do bring up a lot of valid points. There are plenty of trans people who have testified saying that children shouldn't transition. There have been detransitioners obviously saying the same thing. Not every trans person is a monolith, but I don't think all of these bills should just be smeared as anti-trans, even the obviously unconstitutional drag ban ones, because drag queen is not the same thing as transgender person. But I am, however, empathetic to the notion that transphobia is very rampant right now. That's very clear to me, especially given what Natalie has presented in her videos. And I do also think that transgender people are discriminated against when it comes to employment and housing, which is like not okay at all. And I do think when it comes to bringing up gender identity as a protected class, this could probably be brought on by constitutional measures, especially since you are already not allowed to discriminate against women or men. But it's true, there is a lot of extreme, bigoted, transphobic rhetoric, like eradicate transgenderism and all kinds of things that are like really not okay, and I really empathize with people who do feel under threat. I also find it extremely harmful that so many of these trans positions have become so politically polarized, and that the culture war has made this such a polarized issue, because it squashes dissent in terms of people who advocate for trans rights, all the different nuances within that and what they mean, and it allows for people to be super black and white in a way that directly harms people. As this topic becomes more heated, we do have to deal with bigots and their arguments in the public sphere, whether it's comfortable or not. There has to be dialogue there. Where I take issue with Contrapoints, however, is her insistence that bigots can't change their mind through debate, even though this has happened through every civil rights movement since like the abolition of slavery. People who have been bigoted had changed their minds. And like Contrapoints rightly pointed out as well, you don't need to change every single person's mind, although in most cases you at least need some sort of majority consensus. There are people who could be stuck in their views even up until death, like Anita Bryant. But this is what Contrapoints has to say on changing bigots' minds.
And Megan Phelps Roper and centrists like her are wrong that civil conversation can resolve this.
Call out the deviants among them and eradicate these monsters from society.
Even though she showed earlier examples of the Unite the Right guy and the KKK de-radicalizer guy, and I'm pretty sure the KKK has probably said things more extreme than what those TERFs are saying, so I disagree with Natalie's point on civil conversation. I think it does work on some people. But now let's watch her define an enemy for trans activists to rally around, as well as making extraordinarily sexist claims about TERFs, saying that they're too stupid to make up their own minds and are being puppeteered by right-wing men.
I would advise trans people and our allies to keep in mind that JK Rowling is not the final boss of transphobia. She's not our devil. The devil is the Republican Party, the Conservative Party. The devil is patriarchy. It's the right-wing men who will be the ones to put gender-critical theory into brutal practice. Anita Bryant, Posey Parker, and JK Rowling are, to borrow a term from TERFs, handmaidens. TERFs are the real handmaidens. They're useful idiots who put a concerned female face on the patriarchal violence against trans people that will ultimately be enacted by right-wing men.
And listen, I'm not a TERF by any means, and I don't support their ideology. I don't even call myself a feminist, to be honest with you. But I've discussed this behavior on my channel before, and I'll say it again, and that's that I'm tired of progressives who say that they're against sexism or that are feminists denigrating any woman who has a difference of opinion as being because they're stupid and because they're being manipulated by men, or they only believe what they believe because they want men to like them. That's so sexist. Just because a woman has a different opinion from you, even if it is a bigoted opinion, doesn't mean that it's because she's so dumb that a man literally has to implant it in her. And then her final call to action doesn't make sense to me, which I'll explain after I show the clip.
People like Michael Knowles and Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump cannot be persuaded. They have to be defeated.
And I wish Contrapoints would explain what she means by they have to be defeated after she's advocated against debate, persuasion, she's advocated for shunning bigots and just having people ignore them, as well as smearing people who debate and defend their rights. Because politicians and presidential candidates especially are essentially running a popularity contest, like they reflect what their voters want. If 99% of Republicans wanted children to be able to transition, Donald Trump wouldn't use "I don't want kids to transition" as a goal for becoming president. He would change to reflect the voters, and if he didn't change, the voters would vote for somebody else. Like, that's kind of how democracy works. So in that sense, defeating a candidate would be through persuading the fan base. And listen, I'm not out here completely defending our political system because I think it's totally corrupted by the two-party system, which I've already made a video on. But outside of presidential campaigns, I grew up here in California watching the majority of people vote against gay marriage in terms of Proposition 8, only for years later to have changed their mind until now we're in a place where the majority of people in both political parties support gay marriage. Like, people's minds do change. Persuasion and debate works. I've had my mind changed through debate. I've changed other people's minds through debate. I assume you have too, Natalie. Most people aren't extreme bigots incapable of changing their minds, even if people like that do exist. But like with Anita Bryant, they can be mocked and made fun of as the world moves on. We don't need 100% consensus on everything to make progress, as you've already noted. And so if you take all the explicit arguments Natalie takes literally, you will see that she's technically not arguing for anything in this video other than to vaguely defeat the Republican Party by some means other than persuading voters. Throughout this video, she denigrates debate, civil conversation, and de-radicalization without ever saying that censorship isn't okay. This leads me to believe that she is pro-censorship. As a result, the overall vibe of her videos strikes me as extraordinarily authoritarian. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know your guys' thoughts down below. I feel like this video should have pretty much pissed off everyone from every ideological group. But those are just my thoughts on this topic. Let me know what you guys think. I don't delete comments, although YouTube sometimes does. I'm sure there's going to be so many disagreements that people have, and that's perfectly fine. Feel free to voice them. If you like the video, like it. And maybe let me know down below as well. Hopefully it won't be too much of a shitstorm. And yeah, subscribe to my channel if you're interested, and I will see you in the next upload. Bye.